So what even is the Bible? Hi, this is Gilgamesh. I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. Who was it written for? Scholars, priests, lawyers, politicians, or maybe the common man? It shouldn't be thought of as a single thing. Depending on who is counting, there are 24, 39, 46, or even 49 books to it. But even this doesn't do it justice. It's a choir of competing voices with different views and different agendas. Sometimes it openly contradicts itself. Maybe the best example of this is Proverbs 26. What are we supposed to do with a fool in his folly? I can't answer internet comments until I know. But it also gives us both soaring rhetoric and horrific commands. It gives us visions of a grand utopian future and an afterlife, as well as a resounding note on the finality of death. It assures us of the importance of our efforts in this life and mocks us for the futility of what we do. I don't intend to answer any of these questions, but I think there's value in acknowledging that they exist and were of great importance to the authors. The text challenges us to grapple with them in all of their contradictions. The text itself was composed over several centuries and by authors who had very different lives from each other and certainly from us. A large portion of it is poetry. The texts were quite likely all composed first as oral compositions, then later committed to writing. This is logical because writing was a limited skill and required relatively expensive materials, something we can't quite comprehend today. The modern process of composing multiple drafts of a document would have been irresponsibly extravagant. Oral transmission allowed an author to refine the text in important ways until it was ready to be preserved. It's a bit of an open question if the author would have committed it to writing in his own lifetime or if that would have been the work of disciples, possibly much later. Most people had limited, if any, reading skills and would have interacted with these texts primarily from skilled performers in communal gatherings. Small communities would likely have had limited access to written text, and oral transmission was a much more practical method throughout the ancient world. Much of the poetry leans heavily into sound play and double meanings. Some of it shows heavily formalized rules of structure. We can also logically assume that there was a much larger body of texts in circulation and that only the most significant pieces were committed to writing. Even as the first drafts were being placed into writing, each time they were copied by hand was seen as a time to improve, clarify, or expand the underlying text. Many of the books clearly have a narrator voice breaking in to explain things that seem out of place to his listeners, making it clear that many of these texts are preserving or editing much older stories. So when did it become the texts that we know today? For this, we largely have to guess. The Dead Sea Scrolls were an historic find that gave us a clear end date. The texts had largely taken their modern forms by the end of the 2nd century BCE, something that was disputed until the discovery of the scrolls. But that is still a very late date, much later than the traditional dating of the text. To say much about how the text developed earlier than this becomes mostly a matter of guesswork, and opinions diverge dramatically. We do have extra biblical sources that verify the existence of some people and a few of the events, but that hardly tells us much about the transmission or editing process of the text. We have a few remarkable finds, such as the Ketephenolm inscription, which is our oldest archaeological find of scripture. It is scripture that is engraved on metal plate, something that was largely unknown until modern times, and it was probably used as an amulet. It contains what is clearly a passage of the priestly blessing from Numbers. This pushes evidence for that particular passage back to the 6th or even 8th century BCE. It does not prove that the entire Torah, or even the book of Numbers, existed back then, but it does prove that these books contain ideas that are at least that old and were held in reverence by people at that time. Unfortunately, staring back into the past is a speculative process. There is, internal to the text, some features that some see as indicating composition of the passages as far back as the 10th or even 11th century, pushing things back almost to the traditional dates. There are other features of the text that are seen as dating to the Babylonian or Persian or even Hellenistic periods that push composition or editing of the text to a much more recent time and not much older than the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. There is no reason to expect any agreement on these issues unless more evidence is located. Many modern readers attribute to the Bible marvelous power to predict future events. They see its composition as divinely guided, and some see its words as inerrant. It is unclear to what degree its actual authors saw it this way, or if these were ideas that were attributed to the text by later generations. It is doubtful that each author had access to the same texts, and they certainly had no reason to see all the texts put out from their culture as a single literary composition. As time passed, later generations would concretize the corpus of the text into a single book we now know as the Bible, and theologians would work diligently to unify and homogenize the message contained within it. While I certainly don't want to criticize or discourage anyone's approach to the text, there is a certain beauty in the unruly and disorganized thoughts of an entire culture across centuries of change that pushes the value of the text into a timeless classic. So what is the Bible? It is a collection of writings from a long-vanished culture and civilization. It is a voice speaking from the dust across thousands of years. It does not tell a single message, but it grapples with all of life's important questions. You will not find an easy, clear answer to much of what separates the religions of the modern world, but you will find thoughtful exploration on the purpose of life, the role of ritual worship, the idea of covenant and nationhood, the moral and ethical treatment of the poor, the place of government and laws, and many stories of bravery and confrontation of worldly power, and the intervention of God into history. All of this set in the backdrop of a cruel and brutal world spanning the late Bronze Age through the Iron Age, focusing on a people that, despite all of their stories of the glory of their own nation, were actually quite vulnerable and rightly scared of the much larger world powers that were moving around them. I hope you enjoy my channel.